So if you're like me and you like sports or you like to talk about sports, you may occasionally find yourself in the middle of or on the side of a heated discussion about some aspects of sports and who's better than who. A topic that sometimes comes up is what's the best city to be in as a sports fan in North America and what's the worst city? And this may especially come up if you have any friends who are Cleveland Browns fans, for example. And I've seen a number of people try to do an analysis of this where you come up with a ranking due to some set of criteria. And I wanted to sort of do my own because there are some things I didn't like about the ones that I found, and I kind of like to play with numbers anyway. So I did this several years ago. I came up with an answer. I just kind of did it for myself, and I sort of dusted that off again and recalculated the numbers. And I thought this time, why not go ahead and make a video so everyone else can judge for yourselves what you think of this analysis and just use it for whatever purposes you deem appropriate. So the ones that I've seen, either they have some judgment calls, like they'll say, this city has won these championships and the atmosphere is there is really nice and the stadiums are old, so negative points for that. But there's some judgment calls about how nice the city is or how nice the facilities are, and I wanted to keep this as free of my opinions about how crappy a place Dallas, Texas is as possible. And so just try to go completely based on data that everyone agrees with. And so it's judged entirely on championships. Because, it's also, I thought about, well, what if you make it to the playoffs? Isn't that good? What if you get to the championship but don't win? But if you live in a city that gets snow by the foot and lost 4 Super Bowl championships in a row, is that a good thing? Does that make you happier to live in that city, or does it make you less happy? So I decided to just go with winning the championship as the only criterion for whether you're happy that year for that sport or you're unhappy. And then the other thing that I've seen in some of these analyses is they only go back a few years. I saw one guy talking about his model, and he says, I only went back for 30 years. No one cares what happened more than 30 years ago. Well, this guy was, I think, maybe 40 years old, and so I can see why he has that opinion. But I remember Larry and Magic and Michael. I even remember the skyhook from when I was little, Kareem shooting the skyhook. I remember the Super Bowl shuffle. I remember the I-70 World Series. I remember George Brett being very upset about how high the pine tar was on his bat. I don't remember whether it was the same year or not, but that's a personal problem for me that has nothing to do with how important it is in the history of sports. But the point is that memories go back a long ways, and these kinds of discussions about how proud you are to be in a city, people remember championships for a long time. And even if they don't remember them, they can still find them in the history books. And so just out of respect for the fans who have longer memories than others and the historians who will look up what happened in the earlier years, I want to respect history and go as far back in the record keeping as possible. So what I've done is I'm looking at these 5 major sports. So baseball, football, hockey, basketball, and soccer. And in baseball, I'm going all the way back to the first World Series, which was 1903. Now, I realize that was a long time ago, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to weight this so that the further back we go in history, the less important it is for the score of today of how popular the sport is, okay? But we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the World Series in baseball. For football, the Super Bowl started in 1966, but there were national champions for football all the way back to 1920 for something called originally the American Pro Football Association, which quickly became the National Football League. There were a few years where the American Football League operated independently and somewhat equally to the NFL before they merged into the NFL and started the Super Bowl, which has become at least the single most important, let's say, North American sports event every year. NHL, the Stanley Cup, believe it or not, goes all the way back to the late 19th century. But before 1915, I had a lot of trouble decoding exactly who all was competing for the championship. I could find the winners all the way back into the late 1890s, I think, but I couldn't figure out what all the teams were who were competing for it. So my record started in 1915, and you'll understand why I need to know who is competing as we go forward, as I explain how this model works. For basketball, we're starting with the first NBA championship in 1947. And then soccer in the North America is, or let's say, meaningful, impactful professional soccer is a more recent phenomenon. And so we're only going back to 1996 for that, which was the first Major League Soccer Cup. So I'm calling this the Joy and Misery Index. Okay, so the JaMI. The JaMI, the Joy and Misery Index for sports in North America. Now, the way I'm doing this is the scores are for cities based on the teams that are within that metropolitan area. Okay, so the Brooklyn Nets count for New York because Brooklyn is in New York. If it's in the metropolitan area, then that team contributes to the joy or misery of that city for each year. And the way I do it is if the championship comes to that city in that sport in that year, that city receives positive points, which means joy. Every other city that has a team that did not win the championship gets some misery for that year. And the important thing about this is those points all sum to 0. Okay, so the number of positive points equals the number of other teams in the league, and the number of negative points is 1 each time. Okay, so that all sums to 0, and that's really important because that allows us to go back in time. And when a city doesn't have a team that's competing in that sport, it also gets a 0. And so that allows us to look throughout history and be consistent in our treatment of the Joy and Misery Index over time. And I will show you examples so you can see exactly how this works. So the number of teams is going to be really important because remember the positive score is equal to the number of other teams that are competing for that championship. And you can see that that has varied significantly. It's generally trended upwards over time. And so the scores get bigger over time. Your chance of winning it's harder to win because you're competing against more teams. And so when you do win, the joy is just that much greater. So if we're looking at football, the Joy and Misery Index. So in 2025, and I realize the Super Bowl is in 2026, but the season was in 2025. And originally the Super Bowl was in the same year as the season, and so I just kept it consistent. So the 2025 season for the NFL, the Seattle Seahawks won. There were 31 other teams, so Seattle gets 31 points of joy for football for 2025. Now, I haven't shown every city here. Obviously, this is just for informational purposes. But you see Cleveland gets a -1, Kansas City gets a -1. Los Angeles gets -2 because they have two teams, right? So they get -2 because they had two teams that didn't win. Philadelphia gets -1. St. Louis has had football teams in the NFL over time. They currently do not. So for the 2025 season, St. Louis didn't have a team, so they get a 0. They get neither joy nor misery for the 2025 season. Now, as we go back in time, we want the points to taper off, okay? People care more about who won in 2025 than they do in 2024, and they care a whole lot more about 2025 than they do 1935 or 1960. So the further you go back in time, the less impact that result is going to have on your current opinion of how sports are in your city. So what we're going to do is divide all the previous scores by the number of years ago it is, +1, because last year is going to be divided by 2. So 1 year ago, you're going to divide by 2. Okay, so this is how that works. 2024, the Philadelphia Eagles won. They beat 31 other teams. But that was last year, so we're going to divide that by 2. They only get 15.5 points for that. Everybody else gets minus points if they had a team. LA is going to get -1 because they had two teams. Everybody else gets -0.5. St. Louis didn't have a team, so they get a 0. Then you go back to the previous years, so 22 and 23, Kansas City won both of those. They're not getting as many points for that. Because that's longer ago, but you can see that their 2 wins from 22 and 23 add up to a little more than Philadelphia's win in 24. And I don't know, that seems about right. Like if we're talking about bragging rights, I think winning 2 in a row in the last 4 years is going to win over winning 1 last year. But maybe that's not as cool as winning the most recent one, which is 31 points. So, this is the one where I did kind of make a judgment call, what to use to divide by. But for me, this feels about right. We're going to go back one more year, 2021, Los Angeles won. I wanted to include this because you see, they only get 30 for that. Why? They beat 31 other teams, correct, but one of the other teams they beat was also in Los Angeles, okay? So they get +31 and -1, which means they get 30, and it was 5 years ago or 4 years ago, so we're going to divide by 5, and everybody else is getting those negative points. Now, you just keep going back in time like that. I threw in one other year just as an example, 1999. St. Louis had a team in 1999. This was the greatest show on turf back in 1999. They beat 30 other teams. That year there were actually only 31 teams in the NFL, believe it or not. So they got 30 points for that, and because it was a long time ago, we're dividing by 27, so that only gives them 1.11, but we haven't forgotten that, okay? That win still counts. They still have a positive outcome, and it's still going to add to the joy in St. Louis for sports fans. Believe it or not, Los Angeles in 1999 had 0 NFL teams, so that's why they have a 0 for that. And so we go all the way back to the beginning of the AFPA, or the APFA, I guess, and take all of those results and add them all together, and you get this. Cleveland is, in fact, a low number, -4.2, but we're going to see that's not the lowest number. Kansas City is still positive. The recent Super Bowl winners are positive. Usually the first place team here is going to be the most recent winner, but not always. So this is our JaMI for football, and this gives us a rating of how much football joy there is in the various cities. Now, we're not quite done yet. On top of that, I don't want to give the same points for soccer and hockey that I do for football, because that's just not the way joy and misery work in North America. Football is the most popular sport in North America, so a Super Bowl championship should count more than a Stanley Cup and certainly more than an MLS championship. And thinking about how to do this, again, I didn't want to just kind of say, oh, I think this is worth twice as much or something like that. So what I'm using is something called the Ngram percentage. This is Google keeping track of how often a word is used in books in the English language And in fact, it breaks it down to American English. And so I just look and see how often does the word football appear? How often does the word baseball appear? And I use that as a proxy for the popularity of the sport. And it turns out to match pretty well with sort of what you think it should be. So here's what these numbers look like. This is from Google, the Ngram. Football is, in fact, number one. It gets mentioned the most. Now, I know there might be some confusion here because soccer is called football in a lot of other countries. But again, there's this is American English, right? So Google breaks it down for you by that. So this is American English, and American English football means football. Baseball second, basketball third. Soccer's actually above hockey. And I know this is maybe a little misleading because if you look at the premier sports league in the world for football, baseball, basketball, or hockey, it is either arguably or certainly the one in North America. NFL for sure. Major League Baseball almost for sure. NBA, I don't think you get much argument there. And the NHL, I think that's also going to be the premier league. For soccer, it is not MLS. Now, I did look, and right now it's rated about 10th in the world, which is up quite a bit over the last few years. So it is more popular. But I do realize that is, I guess that's a weakness of this model because it maybe overemphasizes the results of soccer a little bit because soccer popularity in North America is greater than MLS popularity. But I still think if your city wins a soccer championship, that's significant. That's going to come up in these discussions in the bar if you really break down to it. And it's not going to be nearly as important or weighty as a basketball, football, or baseball championship, but compared to an NHL championship, maybe at least it's competitive. So this is what I'm using. Okay, so now we make that adjustment. All I've done here at the bottom is I've multiplied by that factor. So this is that Ngram factor that I showed you on the previous slide. And this will, when we add up the total score for all 5 sports put together, this will be important. It doesn't change the ratings at this point because we're just looking at football. But when we consolidate with the other sports, this will be important. So this is the current JaMI ratings in football for these 6 cities. And I just wanted to show you here, this is kind of the way this works. So this is a really clean case, right? Green Bay has 1 football team for every year that there's a football championship, and they've never had any other sports teams. So their football JaMI and their overall JaMI are the same. And you can kind of see how this works. So you go along, this is the first year that there was a football championship competed for, and they're losing, getting more miserable. Then they win, and all of a sudden it goes skyrocketing upwards. And then the joy of that sort of fades as they lose again, and then every time you win, it comes up again. And so Green Bay has actually won a lot of championships. You can see this lists all of them since the beginning of football. And the most recent one is in 2011. And I wanted to point out, look how big this is now. Now, there are 2 things going on here. Look, compare 2011 to 1965 to 68 when they won 4 in a row. So you say, well, they won 4 in a row. This should be huge compared to this. Well, there's a couple things going on here. One, they weren't beating that many teams. There were a lot fewer teams in the mid-60s. And so the joy of winning was not as great. And the other thing is that the popularity of football in the country or in North America, let's say, at the time was not as great as it is now. So the hit of winning is much bigger now in terms of the overall impact. So for football only, this is the answer. Okay, this is where we are in 2026. Not surprisingly, Seattle is number 1. And then you kind of go down, you see how Kansas City has had some wins over the last few years, and so they're just ahead of Philadelphia. Boston, the Patriots play in, oh, I forget the name of this city they play in, but it's within the Boston metropolitan area. So the Patriots wins go to Boston, and they won in, I think, 2014, 2016, 2018, and some other years earlier than that. And so that joy sort of still continues to permeate the city, and so they still have that that good taste in their mouth from those 3 wins and the earlier wins. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers did win in, I want to say, 2020 maybe. So it's somewhat recent, but that has faded quite a bit, and they lost a lot before and after that, and so their joy is lower. So that's kind of how it works. The all-time high, this was, I think, the Tom Brady era for Boston, and so the all-time high for joy in football was 2018 in Boston with 79. The most miserable right now is Minneapolis. I can't remember if they ever won a Super Bowl, but if they have, it's been a very long time. And you can kind of see these scores are all kind of close. These are teams who have had a lot of NFL teams and not won any championships, if any. I know Detroit won at least one early on. I think the rest of these cities maybe never won one at all. Now, the all-time low, though, is San Francisco, Oakland. And you say, how can that be? The 49ers have won a few. The Raiders won. Yeah, but think about it. You've got two teams within the San Francisco, Oakland metropolitan area, and when they're both losing for a long time, that you got double the misery. So it's been a long time since one of those teams in that metropolitan area has won. Oh, in 2017, it had been a long time, and so in 2017, that was the all-time low for the score of football fans in a metropolitan area. Now you can do the same thing with baseball. Currently, the Dodgers, I think, have won the last 2 World Series, so obviously they're dominating this. The Astros won a few. They won a couple recently. The Red Sox had a win, and somehow those other 2 teams are on there. So you can see this kind of makes sense. For baseball, for sure, almost all the joy is in the West Coast now with Los Angeles. The all-time high, however, was back in 2000 when the Yankees were just winning all the time. So 69.61. I don't know if the Dodgers win again this year, they may actually go over that just because they're playing so many teams and baseball is pretty popular. Most miserable, there you got Cleveland up at the top, San Diego, and you can see the others. Chicago, again, was the all-time low, 2004. There are 2 teams in Chicago, right? You got the Cubs and the White Sox, and if they're both losing for a long time, then the misery really piles up. Basketball, same story. Oklahoma City, of course, is going to be number 1 with the most recent championship. The Golden State Warriors have won a few recently, so they're up there. And then you got Boston, Denver, and LA. The all-time high was the Lakers in 2010. It was Los Angeles in 2010 because the Lakers had been winning. Most miserable right now in New York. Again, you've got the Knicks and the Nets in New York. They're both losing for a long time. So they're the most miserable now, and they also have the all-time low from a few years ago, from 2017, which is about the same negative score as it is now. Yeah, and then you've got some other teams in there that you may expect: Phoenix, Atlanta, Indy, and Utah. Hockey, Miami, I don't follow hockey that much, honestly, but I knew I had to include this in here because if you've ever met any hockey fans, you know that you have to include hockey. And that's why I also included soccer because, if you look at that the Ngram mentions soccer was ahead of it, so I thought, well, if I do hockey, I have to do soccer, and I have to do hockey. So again, I'm not a huge hockey fan. It's still a little weird to me that a city in Florida where you never get any ice is winning, but that's how it is. I guess you get ice indoors when you make it. So Miami, I think, has won the last two championships in hockey, so they're dominating there. And then you've got some other past winners. All-time high is Pittsburgh in 2017. I think that must have been Sid Crosby's heyday. Most miserable, again, we got New York. You've got the Islanders and the Rangers there, and they haven't won in a long time. And in fact, that's an all-time low, believe it or not. That's the lowest any city has ever been for hockey. And then finally, soccer. Again, Miami. Miami is killing in these sort of minor major league sports, if you will. I think they may have won the last. No, I think it's just the last one for soccer with Messi there. So for sure they're excited, and this is a source of joy for the city of Miami to win an MLS championship. I know there's a lot of excitement there for that, and there should be. Soccer's a great sport. I've become a big fan. My kids kind of made me into a soccer fan, but I'm more of a Premier League fan than MLS fan. But I just like to watch people compete in sports at the highest level. I watch any sport, honestly, men's, women's, high school, college, doesn't matter. Okay, so anyway, yeah, here you go. Soccer, Miami number one. Then you got LA, Columbus has won recently, and then some minor ones. The highest one ever was LA last year when they won, I think, just two in a row, or maybe three of the last four. I can't remember. Most miserable, you've got a lot of close scores there. Dallas and Boston are tied. I think they've each had a team as long as MLS has been around, and neither of them have ever won. Again, New York had the all-time low. The cities that have two teams, they have the best opportunity to go to either extreme, either high or low. And that's why I think you see New York and Chicago and LA there. Okay, so now we have all five of our sports. All we have to do is add those scores together, and we can see what is the most joyful city in North America to be a sports fan, and what is the most miserable city in North America to be a sports fan. And here you have it. Los Angeles is number one. That makes sense. They've won the last two World Series. They won a Super Bowl not that long ago. I think they had some soccer championships in there. So yeah, it's a good time and place to be a sports fan. It's Los Angeles right now. So they're number one. Seattle's number two, almost exclusively by virtue of the Super Bowl win. But let's face it, the most recent Super Bowl winning city is always going to be towards the top of this list. And it's often number one on the list, but not always, which is kind of one of the things I like about the way this index turned out. So Seattle's a good place to be right now, but they don't have a lot of championships to surround that one Super Bowl win. It's not up there with LA, but it's still number two. Kansas City's had a couple recent Super Bowl wins. They had a World Series win. I don't know. They may have had something else in there. And then Miami, by virtue of those the successes with soccer and hockey, is in fourth. Oklahoma City won the most recent NBA championship, and so they're on the board as well. The number one place ever is 2018 in Boston. 2018 Boston was a great time to be a sports fan. They'd been winning Super Bowls. I believe they'd been winning NBA championships. The Red Sox may have had a championship in there as well. Some other stuff I don't remember. But yeah, I think it was mostly Tom Brady sprinkling the joy in that area during that time. Tom Brady and his supporting cast, with all those Super Bowl wins, really, especially in recent history, those give you a really high number. And I think that's appropriate. So, maybe not exactly what we would have predicted, but I think all of these results make sense. Most miserable, when I put this together the first time a few years ago, I thought it might be Phoenix. I know a lot of people, Cleveland springs to mind, but, the Cavs just won an NBA championship not that long ago, so that kind of takes them out of the running. But Minneapolis makes sense when you think about it. They've had a team in all 5 sports for a very long time, and they haven't won anything, at least that I can remember. You have to go back a long ways. So most miserable up in Minneapolis. Sorry, guys. I hope you can win something. I had nothing against you, but I mean, it's been a long drought up there. Second place. Now, New York was not, when I did this the first time, New York was not anywhere in the picture. But when you've got 2 teams in every sport and you don't win for a long time, your score is going to come screaming down. And so New York, I believe, and I'm going to show you a graph here in a second, I believe if they don't win a championship over the next year, they're going to pass Minneapolis as the most miserable sports city in North America. Phoenix, I was thinking they might be number 1. I wasn't thinking about Minneapolis, but the Diamondbacks did win a World Series not that long ago, so I think that's keeping them out of first place. Detroit and Cincinnati, those are 2 other cities that you can associate with a long drought of championships. And the all-time worst is also Minneapolis from a few years ago. It's been more or less constant since then. Actually, these Ngram mentions are trending down slightly over the last few years, and so that's why the misery index is also trending slightly down over the last few years for the teams who haven't won in a long time. So Minnesota has been the most miserable place to be a sports fan in North America for several years, although it might be New York next year. Yeah, I just wanted to show you this. So this is the joy in sports cities, and this is kind of how this goes. So I mentioned Los Angeles. They've had quite a few wins. The numbers for the big cities like Los Angeles and New York tend to be more erratic. They go up and down. They get more championships, but they also have double the impact when they lose because they have 2 teams there. So you see Los Angeles going up and down, but especially with those 2 World Series wins over the last 2 years, they've moved into first place. Kansas City won 2 Super Bowls, and so they were at an all-time high. They were in first place last time I looked at this. They haven't won anything in the last couple of years, so they're coming down. Seattle was down here in the misery side. They were below 0 until the Super Bowl win, and you can see what a Super Bowl does for your city. You go screaming up. And then Miami was also on the misery side, but the last couple of years they've won those, you put all the soccer and hockey success together, and that gives you a little bit more than one NBA championship, which is what Oklahoma City has. So you see Kansas City, Miami, Oklahoma City are all pretty close together there. But that's your top 5 for joy. And then your bottom 5. And so these nearly flat lines are these cities that just can't win. Cincinnati, Detroit, Phoenix, Minneapolis. They've got, 1 team per sport, generally speaking, and they just haven't won in a long time. But then look at New York. They come screaming down because they're getting double the misery for every year that they don't win. They have this 1 tick upwards, and I believe that was a soccer championship in 2021 by the New York Football Club, if I recall. But that's it. And that gives them some joy, but that just barely got them above 0. And then they've come screaming down again. And that's what I think if they don't win this next year, they probably would come down here below Minneapolis. There are 76 teams. There are 76 cities in North America that have had at least 1 professional sports team competing for a championship at some point. You see a lot of these, so you sort of look at 14 is Akron, Ohio, and you go to say 36, which is Dayton, Ohio. So those 20 or so teams haven't had much history with professional sports in North America, but they did have a little something. And so they're very close to zero. But if you really want to hit the record books, you can find that they did have professional teams at one point in time. So I was surprised. It was kind of fun digging all this information out and kind of seeing, some of these smaller cities that you would never expect to have ever competed actually did have some professional teams and won some championships. Like look at number 15 there, Providence, Rhode Island. They won, I believe, a football championship early on. And I think, Rochester. Rochester's another interesting one. They won some basketball championships in the early days. And they also lost some stuff too. So anyway, I just wanted to put this up here so that you could look and find your city and see where you currently rank. The other thing I like about this model is you can look and see historically how this has gone, and it gives you sort of a snapshot of sort of the way sports have been in North America over time. So the first thing to note is that the overall total joy is trending generally upward. And again, it's because sports are just getting bigger. The sports are getting generally more popular. The leagues are getting larger. And so the payouts for winning in terms of joy are higher. And so I think this all makes sense. You kind of capture that trend of how sports are getting bigger in our lives, and then you can see how the most joyful place to be a sports fan has changed over time. Recently, it's been Los Angeles, Kansas City, Boston, New York. You can kind of see in like the mid to late 50s, early 60s, New York was a place to be for sure, which makes it kind of strange that New York is the place not to be now. Like, it's trending the most down. Green Bay, with just one professional sports team, has been the most joyful place to be at times when they're winning Super Bowls or football championships. And yeah, the joy has been spread, all over the United States throughout the history of sports. You can do the same thing with misery. So here, the baton gets passed less often, and it's usually because they win something. So very early on, you got a long history of New York. I didn't realize this, but Chicago was a rough place to be for a long time in like the 50s and the 70s to the early 80s. I think of the Bears winning the Super Bowl and the Super Bowl Shuffle. I think of Michael Jordan and the Bulls. But yeah, there were long stretches of time where they had a lot of teams who weren't winning. Then you got Philadelphia. Surprised me too, because I don't think of them as being necessarily a rough place to be a sports fan, but it sure was around 2000 on the late 90s and early 2000s. And then Cleveland was in first place there for a while, but it's been all about Minneapolis ever since LeBron James took his talents to Cleveland and got them a championship there. So I just thought it was kind of cool to see these graphs over time. So one last thing you can do with this is if you take all of the years for each city and just add it all together. So the cumulative, this is like the everything, like all of the sports added together over all of the years. New York is number one, just ahead of Boston. They're very close. And then Los Angeles is third, San Francisco, Oakland is fourth. So you kind of say, well, it's all the big cities that are hogging all the joy. It's true so far, although Green Bay, is one of the smaller cities on the list, and they're in fifth place, so who knows. The most miserable, Cleveland is on the list, but San Diego is actually the first place for the most cumulative misery. So throughout the history of sports in the city, San Diego has carried a large burden of losing, followed by Cleveland, Atlanta, Minneapolis is there, and also Cincinnati. So Yeah, these results, it's not necessarily the list I would have made, but I think these results do make sense. So that's it for the model. I had a lot of fun putting all this stuff together. I know this isn't like the definitive, authoritative last final word on where the joy and the misery is in the cities in North America, but it's something that if you're in a conversation and you want to fuel your argument or fuel someone else's argument with some random YouTuber's model, now you have more ammunition. At the very least, I mean, I like lists like this. It's just kind of something to think about, conversation starters. So it's there for you to use as you see fit. I hope you enjoyed it. And I like to play around with numbers, so if you like this kind of stuff, I might do some more videos like this when I look at things like this in the future. So thanks for watching. Talk to you later.